World of Warcraft is a game that is now over 20 years old, and the modern game today, in comparison, is virtually unrecognisable. Zones, mobs, abilities, talent trees and everything in between, the game has undergone a major transformation since the original release in 2004. But even all the way back then, there were a ton of changes in the alpha version of the game that never made it to release. So strap in and grab yourself a snack, and let's rewind time way back to the patch of 0.5.3 as we're about to explore the zones of the alpha version of World of Warcraft. Let's start off with one of the zones that has a few changes to it, and that's Tanarus. The moment you enter, you instantly see one of the biggest changes, which is Karazhan. It is completely different. It's much smaller, and the buildings resemble those that you'd find in Ratchet or Booty Bay. It does have the alchemy vendor that sells the nature protection potion, just like in Classic, and on the outskirts you'll find the forge and anvil accompanied by the blacksmithing vendor. As we move towards the coast and reach Steamweedle Port, you'll notice it's quite a lot bigger than the one we've always known. And just like Karazhan, follows suit with the same style buildings. There is also a boat here, which in the alpha, none of the boats actually worked yet, but it did usually indicate where moving boats would be. This is interesting because it could have been incredibly useful. Where it would have connected, however, who knows. Moving further along, the South Sea Pirates are yet to be added, and you can just run along the shore without having to go through a cave. The Caverns of Time are here though, but they look a little different. It's one giant castle wall with a closed gate. It does look identical to the Timbermoor Gate in Azshara, so maybe it was just a placeholder. While I was exploring Unreleased is when I realised that nearly all caves at this time had mushrooms everywhere inside them. Why is this? I'm not totally sure. Maybe it was to fit the aesthetic of what a cold, damp cave is supposed to be. I honestly have no clue, but I thought I would mention it. Some of the biggest changes were in the major cities themselves, such as Undercity. At first it seems pretty normal and about what you'd expect, until you come off the lift and you're instantly on the upper ring of the trade quarter. Honestly, I quite liked this part. Maybe they just pushed them back further on release just to hide their sinister intent of having deadly lifts that would cause people to die from fall damage. As you head towards the outer ring, this is where the big changes start to happen. The circular area where the auctioneers are usually located is now full of slime, with these little docks at each platform almost indicating that there could have been a canal style boat in the game to navigate throughout Undercity. There are bridges that take you over to the outer ring, and although there is some changes with the quarters themselves, they are pretty much similar to release. The huge difference being that there is an upper floor in the outer ring with NPCs, vendors and trainers more scattered around. I must admit the design is actually quite cool, I do like it, but I can completely understand why it was changed into the much more simpler version of Undercity that we all know. This would have been an absolute nightmare for any new player to navigate around. We will get onto some more of the major cities throughout the video, but for now, let's switch it up a little bit. Wait, hold up, we just hit the perfect amount of subscribers. 69. So nobody subscribe so we can keep it just like this. This is what Durnhold Keep looks like in Classic WoW. And this is what it looks like in the alpha. It's completely different. It has different building types. It actually has a keep in the middle that isn't in ruins. There isn't really any higher or lower ground. It is definitely smaller though, but in general I don't think it's that bad. It's way more open and free flowing than the closed off version we know. I guess it just didn't quite meet their expectation of what they thought it would be, so they decided to revamp it. Oi, which one of you just subscribed and ruined the perfect 69. It was one of yous. I guess now we've got to go to 69. Okay, subscribe again. One of the most iconic places in the Eastern Kingdoms is the stone-wrought dam in Loch Modan, easily recognisable for having 3 dwarven heads with water pouring out of their mouths. In the alpha, there wasn't any dwarven heads. There was just sort of windows where the water came out of, and the architecture of the wall was also slightly different. But the biggest difference here is the sheer size of the dam compared to the classic version. It was huge. It wasn't much longer, but it was a hell of a lot bigger and taller. I think adding the dwarven heads was a great touch, but I'm not sure why they made it so much smaller. Either way, both of them are pretty cool though. Now let's take a look at Ironforge, because old Ironforge had the same treatment as Undercity, in the sense that it was kind of a mega city. The first thing you'll notice is that in the commons area, it's completely different. There is not an open area with an auction house and a bank. As you run around the outer ring, you can see bridges above you that you can access and run along, just like Undercity. The outer ring of Ironforge has a second floor full of vendors and trainers. The Flight Master is no longer in the centre next to the Great Forge, but rather on a platform just outside the Hall of Explorers. If we were now to go to the Mage and Priest trainers, which is on the second floor of the Mystic Ward, don't look down if you're scared of heights, because geez, this is quite high up. On the inner ring of Ironforge is where you'll find the Forlorn Cavern and vendors and trainers such as the mining and fishing. Then if we head into the Great Forge, it is completely different. In Classic, it's this big open circular area with lava pouring down and the Great Anvil right in the centre. But on the Alpha, this is what it looks like. And this is the anvil you get. Yeah, this one's not quite as great, is it? You can then take this elevator near the inner circle to head towards Tinkertown and Deep Run Tram area. You'll notice the platform is in the middle and has two entrances. One is supposed to connect Ironforge to Stormwind, and the other is speculated to have been for Darnassus. But as far as I know, it was actually supposed to have been for Gnomeregan because originally it was supposed to have been another capital city, for the gnomes right next to Ironforge. However, because it would have created faction imbalance from the trolls sharing Orgrimmar with the orcs, they decided to scrap that idea and just use Gnomeregan for a dungeon instead. Now, I'm not 100% on that either, but it does sound much more valid than Darnassus. And of course, we can't forget about the old King's Room now, can we? You have to take an elevator from the inner circle to get into the King's Chamber, and on the Alpha you actually find King Magni in here. This is also still in Classic WoW and is often referred to as Old Ironforge. Let's now pop over to Felwood, and the first change that I noticed was a lot of these trees have this sort of visible green slime sort of flowing through them, which isn't like that in Classic. And if we go to the top of Felwood, we find something very interesting. At this time there was no Timbermoor Cave that connects Felwood to Moonglade and Winterspring. There is actually a path that rather than goes up the mountains alongside the Timbermoor camp, just sort of carries on straight into Winterspring through a dwarven tunnel. The tunnel didn't quite lead into Winterspring just yet, as Winterspring itself was completely unfinished, and the entire zone was a literal green wasteland still. But what I do want to point out that most people don't know, is that if you look at the map viewer, you'll see this was the actual plan. Which is why when you come out of the cave in Classic, you aren't directly onto the main path yet, but rather another path that leads onto the main path. After looking at Moonglade, which is mostly the same as Release, there is a change to the entrance though. Again, there is no cave, and in place, what would have been another dwarven tunnel that wasn't connected or mapped out just yet. And like Felwood and Winterspring, the entrance to Moonglade wasn't in the corner to connect towards Timbermoor Cave. I'm guessing it was probably going to be connected to either a different place in Felwood or to the top of Darkshore. As we know, it was instead changed to the three-way Timbermoor Cave system, but who knows exactly what it would have looked like, or why it was even changed in the first place. To the north of Darkshore and the east of Teldrassil was a piece of land that was developed and never put anywhere into the game. On one side it has a path leading upwards with the aesthetics of what appears to be Deadwind Pass, going into a horde style jungle area. Potentially this could have been a small horde base planned on the west side of Deadwind Pass, and because it's quite near to Stranglethorn could explain why it has both aesthetics. It could also just have been another route from Deadwind directly into Stranglethorn. I have no clue, and this area was never implemented anywhere and is only viewable on the alpha patches of 0.5.3 and 0.5.5. The patch of 0.6 onwards doesn't have this, so I'm guessing it was just scrapped. Let's now have a look at another major city that was changed quite a lot, and that's Orgrimmar. Instantly you can tell the colour of this place is way different. It's much more of a Barrens yellow than the Durotar orange that we're used to. You can see the auction house isn't yet implemented into the game, and the bank looks like they aren't doing too well financially just yet. Then as you come up to the tower that would usually take you to the Flight Master, there's actually a path on the left hand side leading over to the Hall of Legends and the Valley of Spirits, both of which aren't here, and it's just a path to the Northern Barrens. The bridge at the top of the tower just leads you to the back end of Thrall's room, which we'll get onto in a second. Firstly we'll go down the drag. You'll notice it's much brighter and it's split into multiple different paths and levels, with one of the paths wrapping all the way around the back and joining the other path just before Thrall's room. The Cleft of Shadows was originally called the Voodoo Lounge. Honestly, I much prefer the Voodoo Lounge. I think this shit sounds pretty cool. This area was still clearly being developed and it was very buggy to look around. The Ragefire Chasm is also missing at this point as well. Now, when we get to Thrall's room, it just feels like a maze, and much more annoying to actually get to Thrall himself. I am definitely glad they changed it before release because honestly, this part sucks. Lastly, we have the Valley of Honor, which was called the Warriors District. And there's a path that also acts as a bridge that goes straight over to the Ring of Valor, which back then was called the Colosseum. The stone-walled building where the hunter trainers usually are is actually a building with warrior trainers inside, and it doesn't have the usual pond that the Valley of Honor usually has. Instead, the fishing vendor and trainer is just sort of in the middle of the path. If we head over to the Blasted Lands, we see a small change here. The mines and Netherguard Keep are switched in positions, and Netherguard Keep itself looks quite different to what it usually looks like. Netherguard Keep though does have a fantastic view of Blasted Lands while you're heading outwards, and yes, the Dark Portal is here, but instead of the one we know, it's using the old Dark Portal model that is used to indicate where dungeons were supposed to be. Let's now pop over to the Deadwind Pass. Most of the area is rocky, even more so than in classic WoW. It actually reminds me a lot of Blade's Edge Mountains in TBC. Karazhan is completely different looking, which is probably not much of a surprise because it's quite common knowledge that Karazhan used to look different. There's not much point me showing you the inside of it because it's all completely untextured at this point. I do want to rather show you the difference in the layout of the zone, because where the Ogre Caves in Classic are to the east, here on the Alpha, there is a completely different path that you can follow higher in the west of the zone, where there's 2 caves at the top, and then another little path leading upwards to a smaller Ogre Cave. Now, if you remember the piece of land we looked at earlier that was to the east of Teldrassil that was scrapped and never used, this looks like the exact place it could have been located. A path leading upwards to this kind of area with Stranglethorn right next to Deadwind Pass. But now, let's take a quick look at Teldrassil. There isn't too much different with Teldrassil, but there is one major change, which is that there is no portal down to Ruttheran Village, because there was no Ruttheran Village at this time. And instead, the portal was just replaced with the Flightmaster being in that location instead, overlooking this beautiful looking waterfall. There is a few notable changes in the Barrens also. Starting off with the Crossroads. It's largely similar to that of Classic, but you'll probably notice there is quite a bit more room in general. It's just less compact. The inn is also a lot bigger. It's much more of a watchtower where you can go all the way up, and there's also the Harpy Questgiver at the top. Camp T is also very slightly different, with there being much less here. One of the biggest changes I noticed was along the Merchant Coast at the bottom where you'd find Northwatch Hold. And this version of Northwatch Hold is absolutely tiny. It's quite pathetic actually in comparison, and thank God they made it much bigger and better. The last small change I want to show you is the Razorfen Downs dungeon entrance. It's much more simplistic. You're straight into the big bony cave leading into the instance portal, rather than fighting through a thorny area before you reach this part. Thunderbluff, just like Teldrassil, is largely the same. Although it does have some small differences that I won't really touch on, the largest difference is the area where the auction house, bank and pond usually is. Instead, we have a few buildings replacing the pond and vendors in different locations. Let's briefly touch on one that is quite popular and well known, which is the old Scarlet Monastery. Rather than having 4 separate dungeons that we know of, they are all meshed into one mega dungeon, but with each of the separate wings being much smaller. Once you zone into the dungeon, you're in the area where you'd usually choose between your 4 wings. There is only 2 openings, which is where the armory and cathedral entrances usually are, but they both lead into the same hallway. Following this through will bring you into the first area with Houndmaster Loxley on your right, and carrying on brings you to Herod. If you go up past Herod, which kind of feels weird because usually you're coming down into Herod, it brings you at an impasse where you can take a left and head towards the graveyard side, which is much more pathetic. Or you can head right and it takes you into the library with no bosses here, then takes you directly into the cathedral. It does look a lot different though. Rather than having all the Scarlet members kneeling down, they are instead standing in front of these benches. At this point, your usual names are here, such as Mograine, Whitemane and Fairbanks. The majority of Stormwind and its layout is largely the same. A few things to note which haven't been developed yet is there is no auction house, the entrance for the Deeper and Tram area is completely blocked off, there is no Champions Hall just yet, and the barracks around the Warrior and Rogue trainers are virtually non-existent. If you watched my recent video about Classic WoW facts, you'd know that the map shown in the original cinematic was taken during the alpha stages of WoW, and if we look down near the Stranglethorn Vale, you'll see 2 extra islands. These are called the Island of Dr. Lapidis and Gillijim's Isle. The first island was supposedly named after an ex-Blizzard employee, Alan Lapidis. What's pretty insane about these islands is just how big they are. Stranglethorn Vale was already one of the largest zones, and these two islands on top of that are the same size as some of the smallest zones. It's clear there was a lot of work put into these islands, and there is a ton of different changes within them, from troll ruins to even a mage tower. What these two islands would have been for, who knows? Was it supposed to be a high level questing area? Was it supposed to be an open dungeon like Jim thought Allure? There's so many possibilities of what it could have been, and I hope one day in the future when we get a permanent Classic Plus, bit of copium, that we'll see these islands re-implemented and completed. But let's get on over to Silithus. Although being one of the last zones created and releasing with zero content, the design of the zone was complete for the most part. The one huge difference, however, was right at the bottom of Ahn'Qiraj. First off, the gates of Ahn'Qiraj was completely different. It's almost set up in a sense where it was supposed to be connected to the zone rather than being instanced, like the two raids that ended up releasing. There is a huge hexagon shape with pillars all dotted around. This is quite similar to Assyrian's room in AQ20. To the left, there is a load of walls that doesn't really seem to mean much in terms of their layout, but a lot of it is still following that hexagon style theme around the edges. Down at the bottom, we have one of the old style Qiraji temples that was very similar to the AQ40 temple that we saw, but it is slightly different. When you go down the temple, it's extremely confusing and easy to get lost in these tunnels. Eventually you'll find your way out, and it brings us to a Cthulhu style room that is very similar in layout but never released like this. The whole area of Ahn'Qiraj that's still clearly a work in progress could have easily been the reason why Silithus was one of the last parts of vanilla to get content, because they could have been deciding what to do with the area for such a long time, and who knows, whether it was supposed to be an outdoor addition to Silithus or whether it was supposed to be instanced, maybe it was both. Now, there is a ton more changes in the alpha client compared to the game that was released, mostly smaller than what we've covered here though. And there is a lot of stuff that we've covered and stuff that isn't in this video that we could speculate on for days of what could have been. And if I was to cover them all, it would be a 6-hour video. So we're going to end it here. Hopefully you saw some new cool places that you never knew existed or got to see them in a little more detail. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.